What is up YouTube? I'm Royal, I'm rank 1 in Wildrift, and today I'm bringing you the most accurate tier list. I've been spamming so many games in the last few weeks, I have finally gotten Challenger and we're still pushing for Sovereign and rank 1. So I have a lot of experience in this patch, so trust my tier list. So let's start off with the jungle where we've probably had the most changes. Last patch I actually did make a bit of a mistake in my tier list. I had Echo in God tier and Lilia in S tier. But obviously the Lilia buffs turned out to be freaking massive. So Lilia is definitely going to be in the God tier. And I only have Echo in the S tier because he's just a little outclassed from the God tier junglers. He's still probably the best option from the S tier junglers though. He's one of the best late game junglers. In the God tier, of course, we have Lilia. Insane champion right now. Massive buffs. If you haven't checked out my Lilia video, I definitely recommend you do so. Then Lee Sin. Lee Sin has always been a God tier champion. He will continue to be just because of how absurd his kit and his damage is in Wild Rift. I think I've had him as my best champion in every single tier list, and he will continue to be the best champion in this tier list. If I would make a Lee Sin tier if I could. Honestly, maybe I will from now on. Next tier list is going to have a Lee Sin tier because of how broken this champion is. Xin Zhao will be joining the God tier champions, mostly because of nerfs to champions that fulfill a similar role to him, like Talon, like Kayn. So next up to this assassin bruiser playstyle is definitely Xin Zhao. He's mostly played as an assassin in high reload and full damage. And of course Master Yi, who I believe is one of the most underrated champions still. Master Yi is unbelievably broken in almost every situation, but in the situations he excels at, where he can also get a support that can buff him up, he's incredibly strong in the early game, mid game, and late game. The new champion Viego is gonna be in S tier. Talon is also going to get demoted from God tier to S tier to do his nerfs. Still a really solid pick. However, he's slightly outshined by Lee Sin, Xin Zhao, and probably Viego now. Viego, I don't think he's strong enough to be put in God tier. I think the God tier champions are simply better than him. But the S tier champions fit a lot more close to him. The other champions are mostly champions you've seen before in my tier list. Not many changes have happened to them. Still, the best carry junglers are in S tier. A tier are still playable and strong champions in the right situations. B tier champions, usually not very strong. However, B tier champions in the right situations can definitely shine and take over games. I want to point out Nyla. Nyla could definitely even be S tier if you just get her in the right comp under the right conditions. Even God tier, this champion can be really broken in the right conditions. However, her early game is very weak and she suffers a lot versus certain team comps. Rammus is another example. If you're versus full AD, Rammus could easily be God tier. However, in most situations, he's just not that strong. And he gets shut down, has a lot of counterplay, similar to Nyla if the opponents play well. Now, I want to point out that in the S tier, we actually have Amumu. Amumu received some decent buffs. And I think you can probably run Sunfire Aegis on him too as a third or even probably a third item, which also got buffed. And he's a great teamfight jungler. He really takes over teamfights. His early game might be weak. However, once you get to this teamfight phase, his ultimate is absolutely game-changing. Another jungler I do want to point out that I believe is very strong, and that's Tryndamere. I don't see Tryndamere very often played. He does have a very unique playstyle, but I definitely think he's very strong. Riven, I think, could be S tier once the buffs come in. To her like mini rework where she can ult again and again. However, she's still gonna mostly be outshined by champions like Lee Sin and Xin Zhao who fulfill a similar role. Now let's move on to the mid lane where the sole God tier champion is gonna be Jace. Jace received kind of an indirect buff with Manamune buff. Now Manamune is actually a solid choice on Jace. You don't have to get it every game. However, if you have a laning phase that is gonna be kind of stale, for example, if you're versus Morgana mid, who just uses her second ability on the wave and you can't really punch her too much, Manamune can be a great choice to buff up your late game. So, of course, he's going to remain in God tier. Morgana has joined the S tier champions because of how broken just setting your second ability on the wave is and just relaxing, chilling, never having to actually lane. I consider it to be very broken because of the utility she provides later into the game. She can get away with a lot in really bad matchups due to her second ability. The Wind Brothers, of course, S tier, will continue to be really strong with his tank build with Grasp. I am expecting some kind of Grasp nerfs, to make this playstyle disappear because it's so broken. Kasdan in S tier, of course, one of the best counters to mages that are meta right now. Syndra, Ziggs, Corki, Veigar, all these mages are absolutely insane in the mid lane right now. Twisted Fate, I have him in A tier. Twisted Fate could probably be S tier too. He's just more of a situational pick, but Kasdan just counters most meta champions right now. I would honestly have him in God tier, however, he gets completely destroyed by the Wind Brothers, by Jace, by Lucian mid, by those types of picks. However, as a counter pick, he's definitely very, very solid. Echo is S tier. Of course, Echo's early game damage is absolutely insane in the mid lane, and I will post some Echo videos in the future that highlight that, and you guys are going to be amazed. And Akali is, of course, one of the most broken and frustrating assassins to play against. However, this patch, she has been feeling a little weaker, and I did debate putting her into A tier. The A tier champions are all very solid. They all have their own niche. They can be strong in the right situations, but for the most part, they're going to get outshined by the S tier champions. I do recommend staying away from the B tier champions unless there's a really good game for them. For example, Annie can be really good, Galio can be really good, just in the right circumstances. I think champions like Zed and Talon, there's just not a lot of reason to pick them right now. Obviously in the C tier and D tier, Katarina is just such a mess. You know that Katarina is bad when she's under Kayle in the tier list. Anyway, let's move on to the Baron lane, where I actually have Kayle in B tier. This is the first Kayle appearance in B tier. I actually think Kayle is pretty strong in certain matchups. However, let's talk about the God tier champions first, where Garen is actually going to be joining the God tier champions with his buffs. I think he's one of the best choices right now. His laning phase is absolutely brutal. He has like the strongest laning phase in the game right now. Ornn, of course, with the Sunfire buffs is going to be even stronger as the best tank to pick. Renekton, again, lane bully that's tankier in the late game, and that kind of seems to be the theme of the God tier champions. And Aatrox just has absurd damage, is the only reason he's there. This champion does way too much damage. In the S tier, you will see champions that are still very, very strong. However, they're not as good as the God tier champions, but if you pick them in the right situations, in the right matchup, you will definitely shine. Baron lane is one of those lanes where matchup really does matter. So if you're able to get Fiora versus Aatrox, Fiora can definitely be God tier, you know? If you can get Jax versus Camille, Jax can be God tier. So it's really about finding those right matchups. In A tier, there's champions that are definitely matchup reliant. You're going to get demolished in a bad matchup, but you're going to shine in a really good matchup. For example, Teemo is one of those champions that I strongly believe in, the young Timothy. I think Teemo is one of the strongest champions in the game. However, if you're playing Teemo versus like something like a Garen, you're just not going to have a good time. However, if you can get Teemo against, I don't know, Gwen, Jax is probably fine, Fiora is fine, you can just sit there and poke them all the time. You just become such a monster in the late game. Like I mentioned, Kayle is going to be leaving the D tier and joining the B tier, and that's mostly because of her armor buffs. She can actually be a good counter pick to a lot of these bruisers, like the Darius, like the Sett, like the Urgot even, just champions that really can't get on top of her, and she can safely farm from a distance and get massive. Finally, let's move on to the ADCs. Actually, I think we still have supports, so not finally. But let's move on to the ADCs. The list for ADCs is fairly similar. Nothing too surprising here. Obviously, Ezreal is going to keep shining. He is the hardest ADC to play, might even be the hardest champion in the game to play. However, if you can play him, he's definitely God tier, so I have to include him there. Varus is an easier option. He continues to be the most flexible ADC. You can play him AD, on-hit, AP, and he's just as effective in all of these roles. Xayah is the best hyper carry ADC, quite a bit better than other hyper carries like Kai'Sa and Vayne, and maybe even Zeri. The S tier ADCs are still really, really strong. Lucian is one of probably the most dominant laning phase ADC. Caitlyn with her range in lane is incredibly annoying to face. Kalista, of course, paired up with the right support, can be a menace. Her damage is insane. And Kai'Sa, of course, will continue to be just a great, great champion. Her first ability just does so much damage. Once you can get your items on her, she's so frustrating to play against. The A tier champions are all great if you can pick them with the right support duo in the right comp. Samira, for example, if you have a good engaged team comp, she can go in and sweep the enemy team. Tristan, one of the best hyper carries. Zeri, one of the best hyper carries. I would recommend staying away from the B, C, and D tier champions. The D tier champions are not even ADCs. I'm just putting them here so you guys know not to play them. The only reason I would ever play Senna, I would play her as a support with like a bruiser ADC, right? Jhin, Vayne, and Jinx are just too weak and too immobile. They just get completely destroyed Vayne just simply takes, like, Vayne can actually be really good if the entire team comp is based around her. So if you have like a Lulu support and 3 tanks frontline and the enemy team has 3 tanks frontline, that's when Vayne can actually be really good, but in most situations is not. Now let's move on to supports. Senna will be A tier here. Senna can literally be God tier if you just play her as a support with an ADC that's like a bruiser and he farms. So if you pair her up with like Ornn, if you pair her up with Galio, Gragas, Nautilus, but those champions farm and you play support, she can be God tier. But for the most part, she's gonna be A tier since you can only do with duo queue, right? You can just tell your ADC, hey, play Ornn in solo queue. I finally decided to put Thresh in God tier. I think Thresh is the best support probably. He's just really hard to play. So if you want to play Thresh, but you're not good at Thresh, just pick Nautilus, because they do the same thing, but Nautilus is a lot easier to play, and this is why Nautilus is in God tier. His point and click ultimate can definitely save you from some really fed enemy junglers. For Enchanter supports, I actually have Yuumi in A tier, and I have Janna and Lulu in God tier. I think Janna and Lulu are just straight up better. Yuumi's only good when you have someone on your team that's insanely fed, and you can sit on them. Other than that, Lulu and Janna just provide more. Pyke unfortunately got a few nerfs. However, if you are a Pyke god, he's still going to be one of the best champions. Braum is actually a great answer to champions like Leona, Nautilus, and Thresh, and he struggles against champions like Janna, Lulu, and Yuumi. So if you can get Braum in the right situation, he can be insane, and this is why I have him in S tier. Then in A tier, you'll have your typical supports that are really good, like the mages, which is Brand, Zyra, Lux. However, they're nowhere near as good as the S tier and God tier supports. But if you can get any of these A tier supports in the right situation, it can be very strong. I do recommend staying away from the B tier and C tier supports. I've been seeing a lot of Morganas and Swain supports, and it's just so weak. It's like if you're a Blitzcrank god and you can hit every single grab, then yeah, go for Blitzcrank. But most people cannot do that, and he just ends up being useless the entire game. So that is it for my tier list. I hope you guys can hit Challenger like I've done using these God tier champions. I hope you enjoyed. If you like this video, leave a like and subscribe for more Wild Rift content.